Hello, I'm Janet Kim Singh, and I'm one of the portfolio managers on the private wealth team at Capstone Asset Management. Welcome to another edition of Your Wealth Matters. I'm joined by my colleague and fellow portfolio manager, Maria Dawes, and today we're discussing different types of inflation. Inflation has been in the headlines now for well over a year, and as interest rates rise, it's a good time to walk through the different types of inflation and what scenarios can bring them into play and where we are now.
Hi, Janet. And yes, inflation is becoming a bigger issue in our everyday lives, from increases in our weekly grocery bill. I know all about that with 3 growing kids, to record-breaking fuel prices. So I do think it's worth taking the opportunity to dig into some of the nuances between the different types of inflation to give better context to where we are and to where we might be going, and maybe give you a better understanding of what all the news headlines are talking about. So first, let's start with the most basic definition of inflation, which is essentially a general increase in prices, which affects our costs of living. So inflation is typically caused by either demand pull factors or cost push factors, which means essentially that inflation can either be caused by an increase in demand or due to an increase in costs, so the inputs of things that we buy. I think the prevailing agreement today is that we're experiencing cost push inflation due to supply chain disruptions, and the war in Ukraine has definitely exacerbated the energy uncertainty, which has caused those prices to go up as well. However, we've also just gone through a major period in North America of really, really low interest rates. And this cheap debt has meant that people have access to a lot more cash. So there's actually, I would argue, a pretty strong demand pull as well in the consumer discretionary and real estate sectors. So Janet, maybe you can remind us how we can actually measure inflation.
Yes, the most common measures of inflation are the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and the Personal Expenditures Price Index, or PCE. These indices basically keep track of a basket of goods like housing, food, and energy costs, and they measure changes over time. Both CPI and a PCE have a headline and a core number. The latter strips out some of the more volatile components, including food and energy. The CPI measures the change in the purchasing power of an average family, whereas the PCE measures the changes in the price of consumer services and goods. We're not going to dwell too much on these indices, but it is useful to know how inflation is measured. Maria, do you want to now get into some of the types of inflation that we're seeing mentioned more frequently these days?
Yeah, of course. So in no particular order, let's maybe start with stagflation, because that's the one we're hearing most about in the media these days. And I think you're seeing many argue that this is probably going to be our biggest threat right now. So in stagflation, we see rising prices, but this could be amidst slow economic growth and even a recession. So rising prices plus recession. So just a hint here to what Janet will talk about in a minute. The key here is that stagflation is likely to include also high unemployment. So this is something that we're watching very closely. Switching gears a little bit, let's talk about disinflation, which should not be confused with deflation. Disinflation is a decrease in the current pace of inflation, whereas deflation is the opposite of inflation. It is marked by a decrease in the general price level of goods and services. Probably we could use a bit of both disinflation and deflation right about now. But to round out the conversation, hyperinflation is when we see accelerating inflation, so inflation increasing at a very high rate. And thankfully, this scenario isn't likely given the central bank's involvement. So that's a lot of information and definitions. How does this affect where we are right now, Janet?
Well, in 2021, the main theme was that inflation was transitory, meaning temporary. And while some pundits stand by this, 2022 has seen the media more concerned over whether we might enter into a period of stagflation. The reason for this concern is that slow economic growth could potentially lead to job losses or loss of income, which could further exacerbate the squeeze on the average household's ability to purchase goods at inflated prices. This means inflation plus recession and higher unemployment that will confirm that we've entered into a period of stagflation. However, for today, even in these times of uncertainties, the economy is in fact still growing, albeit at a slower pace, and unemployment and employment levels are actually pretty strong right now. So we're not there yet. And we also have to remember that the central bank's primary functions are to control both inflation and the employment rate through the overnight lending rate, which trickles through the financial system. This is how and why they raise interest rates. And in my opinion, while jobs remain strong, the Bank of Canada will feel pretty free to keep raising those rates to curb inflation and likely not slow it down until unemployment numbers lets them know the message has been received. So while we need to be aware of the potential risks of inflation and stagflation, there are tools in place to mitigate these risks. Having said that, inflation is still here for now, and it is our hope and expectation that things will settle down as we see interest rates continuing to rise through 2022.
Right. So, Janet, we've said this a few times throughout our discussion, but we have really only touched on the surface. And we're recognizing that inflation is such a large topic and it's hard to do it justice. But I hope that this discussion has shed a little bit of light on this complex issue. To our viewers, please be in touch if you have a question that you'd like to see us answer. And for now, thank you for joining us on another edition of Real Wealth Matters.